Thank you very much, Dr. Frick, for this kind invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. CONVOCO's theme this year is equality in an unequal world, and the topic itself couldn't be timelier because the topic of inequality has entered the public discourse across a broad spectrum of issues with an urgency that I certainly haven't seen in my lifetime. Now, the world has always had mass protests. We've seen a lot of them in the last decade or two. But what's amazing about the passionate mass protests that we've seen in the last decade is that they're about a topic that in principle is pretty abstract, right? The topic of inequality. Surprisingly, economists are not front and center of this discussion. And I say surprisingly because economists are supposed to be the experts, right? We study inequality, we measure inequality. I think the reason why economists haven't played a more central role is that the people in these pictures aren't just talking about the existence of inequality. They're saying inequality is unjust. Now, I'm an economist myself. I go to lots of very not fancy economics conferences, and economists have been talking about inequality forever, okay? We've been talking about it for a long, long time, but with a very few notable exceptions. Notable, they are there, but with a very few exceptions, empirical economists, economists that work with data and analytics, don't talk about justice. What I want to argue for the next 20 minutes or so is that if we don't begin to speak about justice, and by we, I mean empirical economists, we risk losing our relevance. So why don't applied economists who deal with data and policy design on a day-to-day basis, why don't we speak of justice in any meaningful way? I think it boils down to four, I'm going to call them fundamental axioms in economics that will be familiar to all the economists, certainly in the audience. The first is that allocations must be efficient. The second is that evidence must be data-driven. The third is that policies should be forward-looking. And finally, the fourth is that choices are made at the margin. I'll tell you what I mean by each of these in just a moment. I should say before I get there that I think these are extremely useful axioms. Okay, I'm a classically trained, dyed-in-the-wool economist myself, but I also think that these axioms that are so useful in so much of our analysis makes it really hard for us to effectively participate in the current debate on justice. Let me start with the first axiom, okay? And at risk of losing you all at the very beginning, I'm going to start with a definition. Why is that? Not to patronize anyone, but why is that? Because economists use the word efficiency all the time, and we rarely tell people what we mean by efficiency. So let me define it first, and I'm going to walk you through a simple example. Okay, so in economics, an allocation is said to be efficient or Pareto efficient if there is no other allocation in which some individual is better off and no individual is worse off. So there are lots of double negatives in here, so please, with your permission, let me give you a very simple example that I give to my students in my microeconomics class, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, so suppose I have 10 euros, and I can allocate this between two people, a red guy and a green guy. Here is one possible allocation. Red gets 4 euros, and green gets 5 euros. This allocation is not Pareto efficient. Why is that? Well, I've left money on the table. I could give red an additional euro that would make red better off without making green worse off. All right? You'll see from this example why economists' insistence on allocative efficiency is so useful, why it's so important. Why is that? Well, if we don't leave money on the table, we can make society better off, okay? So I'm never going to suggest that we should dismiss the idea of allocative efficiency. Now, this is an allocation where each person gets €5. This happens to be an equal allocation, and it is also Pareto efficient, right? I can't reallocate money between these two people now without making one of them worse off. So with this, you can see the tension that we have between redistribution on the one hand and efficiency on the other hand. Let me give you another example, though. Consider another distribution, and in this distribution, I give red €9 and green €1. Now, I don't need to tell you this is a very unequal distribution, right? But it is also Pareto efficient for the same reason that 5-5 was Pareto efficient a second ago. So what does this focus of economists on allocative efficiency mean for the current debate on inequality? We live in a really unequal world, okay? We live in a world in which the bottom 55%, the bottom 55% of the population has just over 1% of the wealth in the world, and the top 1% of the population has over 45% of global wealth. Okay, we can all agree that this is an extremely unequal distribution, and it also seems patently unjust. Here's the thing. We can talk about whether it's unjust, but it is not obviously inefficient. And for that reason, economists can look at a distribution like this and just not share the same sense of outrage or indignation that the general public feels when they see this. In other words, our focus on allocative efficiency can make us blind to injustice. And this is a serious problem. Okay, I'll get to why in just a moment, but before I get there, let me emphasize that what we do is still very important for understanding inequality. I mean, for one thing, you can see here already, we document its existence, all right? We wouldn't even know that global wealth was so unequally distributed if economists hadn't done the, frankly, completely thankless work and painstaking work of going out, gathering the data, crunching the numbers, okay? So we document the existence of inequality. But we actually do even more than that. We use data-driven evidence to understand what drives inequality. And once we're done with that, we try and figure out how to go about remedying the inequality that we see. Let me illustrate how this works with my second example, which is the gender pay gap. You may have heard the statistic, right? It originally comes from the US. Women are looking at me and nodding knowingly as I show this statistic, that women on average in the US earn roughly 80 cents on each dollar that men earn. Now, this number is different in different countries. If you look at Europe, the gender pay gap, so this is basically the equivalent of that 20% that you saw on the previous slide. It's different in different countries. You see this variation across European countries. In some countries, the gender pay gap is lower. In other countries, I'm looking at Germany here, Austria. This is from 2015, the same year as I showed you a second ago. It's actually higher on average in Austria than it is in the US. But it exists, all right? In every rich country that you look at, there's some kind of gender pay gap. Now, women have looked at this statistical fact and said, hey, what's going on here? We would like equal pay for equal work. Very compelling slogan, right? It's catchy, and economists rightly point out it may be catchy, but it's too simple. Okay, why is it too simple? It's too simple because the premise of this is that the only thing that distinguishes men from women is their sex. And that is simply not true. Men and women differ on all sorts of other dimensions. They tend to have different educations, they study different things, they tend to have different occupations. The obvious thing, and so far this hasn't changed, women bear children and men do not bear children. They work in different industries. I could go on, okay? The list goes on and on and on. And it turns out that at least in rich countries, once you account for these differences, you can actually account for most of the 20-cent pay gap between men and women. So let's suppose, just purely hypothetically here, that education accounts for 5 cents of this 20-cent pay gap. Occupations account for another 4 cents of the 20-cent pay gap. And finally, childbearing accounts for the remaining 11 cents. If these 3 features are what are driving the gender pay gap, then, the next step for us as economists, or any one of us that's interested in thinking about remedying inequality, is to go about fixing these gaps, right? So, for instance, if it's education, what can I do? I can go and, motivate young girls to study science by exposing them to the wonders of science at an early age, or increasing their confidence in math skills. Occupations, well, I can encourage women to become programmers, right? I can invest in their computer skills, or I can have role models in the tech industry that so far has been very male dominated. If it is childbearing, then I can support mothers that are trying to balance kids and work by allowing for remote working, or subsidizing childcare. Now, economists, what they do is, in addition to documenting the existence of inequality, in addition to understanding what it is that actually accounts for this inequality, they do this kind of stuff as well. Okay, so we go out and try and figure out the effectiveness of these policies and myriad other policies as well. So in this way, by using data and analytics, economists are able to, speak to the types of issues that are motivating these demonstrators. I think that this is incredibly valuable. I think that the nuance and the rigor that economists bring to bear on addressing the problems of inequality are indispensable, but there's a catch here. You'll notice that the list that I gave you earlier, for example, education, occupation, and childcare, these are all things that are measurable. Okay, why do I focus on things that are measurable? Well, that's what I do for a living. I use data analytic methods in order to figure out what's going on in this context. But there are a whole bunch of other things that are not directly measurable. Okay, there can be social expectations regarding what women should or shouldn't be doing in the workplace. There may be, perceptions regarding what is or isn't appropriate behavior on the part of women. There may be, values that are, again, not observable, or regarding the worth of what women do and don't do. These things are all important, but because they're not measurable, they don't figure directly in my data analysis, in my econometric analysis. So, although economists have important insights regarding how to address things like gender inequality, the demonstrators in this picture, they're only partly impressed, okay? They're not super impressed at what we do. Why is that? Well, they're asking for something a little bit different, okay? They're in some ways asking for something more than what I am able to offer them in terms of my analysis. They're railing against the institutions like the one they're standing in front of here, because they believe that these institutions for centuries now have been denying them their rights, They've been denying them equality, and they've been denying them justice. And this leads us to the big blind spot in economic analysis, which is that we don't have a compelling framework for addressing historical injustice. Now, a major reason for this is that in economics, policies must be forward-looking. To illustrate why this is important, I have my third example here. Okay, you guys may have seen a scatter plot like this. I don't know how many of you have been to Gapminder and seen Hans Rosling's wonderful presentations, but anyway, so scatter plot many of us are familiar with. What we see in this scatter plot is that wealthy countries with high GDPs per capita, wealthy countries have incomes by this measure that are 50 to 100 times higher than that in the poorest countries. Okay, we live in a very unequal world. You also notice that it's not just income or GDP per capita that distinguishes rich countries from poor countries. You see here that wealthy countries also have much higher life expectancies than poorer countries have already in this simple graph, all right? You see that wealthy countries, wealthy countries tend to be concentrated in the US and in Europe, North America. This is another thing that economists bring to the table, this understanding of the multidimensionality of inequality and the complexity of this multidimensionality. I said that, the wealthy countries are up there and the poor countries are down here, but you'll notice, if you look really closely, that there's a tiny red dot over here in the bottom left, where it's typically countries from sub-Saharan Africa. That country, as you've already seen, is Haiti, all right? Haiti is sort of this outlier. It's in the Americas, North America, but it's poor. So here's a reasonable question for thinking about inequality between countries. Why is Haiti poor? Even compared to its neighbors, okay? Countries in its direct regional vicinity, Cuba, Jamaica, even the Dominican Republic, which is very similar to it in many respects. They even share the same island. I don't know if you know that, but Haiti and the Dominican Republic share the same Caribbean island. Economists will say, this is a classic case study in development economics, which is my field. Economists will say that Haiti is poor because it has weak institutions. Haiti and the Dominican Republic may be similar in many respects, but Haiti has this, sort of brutal colonial legacy, and it's left them with institutions that are based on extractive development rather than inclusive growth. The Dominican Republic, again, not a great colonial legacy, but a different colonial legacy that has left them with a different set of institutions. And for economists, the moral of this story is that the solution to Haiti's problems are to build stronger institutions. Okay, this makes perfect sense. Of course, institutions must be important for economic development. But there's another part of this story that I understand was covered in the German press as well. I don't know if you guys saw this story. I see some nods in the audience. So there's another side to the story that economists know about. They briefly mention in their classes, but they don't dwell on this, okay? Which is that Haiti was a French colony. In 1971, there was a slave revolt, the first of its kind, by the way, anywhere. And Haiti the Haitian slaves overthrew their French masters. Now, 20 years later, and that's what you see in this picture, the French delegation, it's called a delegation, we could talk about whether that's the right word for it, but the French returned with warships and demanded that emancipated slaves pay their former enslavers money. How much money? 150 million francs, okay, which at the time was an awful lot of money. Economists So this was covered in a series in the New York Times earlier this year in May, the Haiti ransom project. So economists estimate that over the next century and a half, these reparations ended up costing Haiti billions of dollars. And during this time, Haiti went from being the richest country to the poorest country in the Americas. All right, now, as a human being, all right, forget economists or whatever, but as a human being, this seems pretty unjust, right? You look at this and say, oh, gosh, surely we owe it to Haiti to somehow right this wrong. This is not a view that's broadly shared among economists, because in economics, policy decisions need to be forward-looking. Past sins may explain how we ended up where we are today, but today's decisions are based on today's payoffs and tomorrow's payoffs, and historical injustice doesn't really matter in terms of what we do next. So economists can look at this picture of a bunch of demonstrators throwing a statue of Edward Colston, who was a slave trader, into the harbor and say to them, and say to themselves, why are you throwing away a perfectly good piece of bronze? And I'd argue that this almost willful ignorance of historical injustice limits our ability to be able to make policy recommendations that resonate with these type of people in these social justice movements. Because in economics, choices are made at the margin. And this brings me to my final example, which is climate change. It's a cool day today, it's raining. I don't know what the weather was like last week here in Salzburg, but in much of the rest of Europe, it was a very hot week. Okay, so most of the world, much of the Northern Hemisphere has been experiencing a heat wave. This was all over the news. Temperatures were at record highs, but the fact of the matter is, as unpleasant as that was, and as unpleasant as climate change will continue to be in Europe, the brunt of climate change is really experienced by developing countries. In the global south, people are poor to begin with, and they've been experiencing biblical types of droughts and floods and storms and rises in sea levels that pose an existential threat to the lives of hundreds of millions of people. I mean, clearly something has to be done. And so global leaders meet, okay, in these conferences to try and find a way, some way to find to try and limit increases in global temperatures. And each time they meet, they hit a brick wall. Why is that? Let's take CO2, okay? CO2 is a major contributor, as we all know by now, to global warming. And if you look at CO2 emissions today, okay, roughly today, who are the biggest contributors, okay? The answer is Europe, the US, okay, we have South America, but then there's Asia, okay? And in Asia, China and India are the big economies. So at the margin, these regions are the largest contributors to global warming. So in order to combat climate change, Europe and the US are going to have to do their part, okay, to reduce emissions. Certainly true, but so is China and so is India. This economic insight is absolutely right, okay? India and China are major contributors to climate, to CO2 emissions today and climate change today. And because their economies are growing, they're also going to be the largest emitters tomorrow, okay? So if they don't curb their emissions, I need to say this politely, we're in deep trouble in the planet. No argument here. The thing is that doing something about this, okay, it's going to be costly if we don't do anything, but it's also costly to do things. So China and India worry about that cost, right? And they look at countries in Europe and in the US lecturing them, and they say, hey, hold on a minute. Climate change is a function of the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. And guess who's responsible for most of the stock of CO2 in the atmosphere? It's Europe and it's the US. So, by the way, over the last 200 years, their economies, European economies, the US economy, has grown at rates that are just unprecedented in human history. And this growth was fed by fossil fuels. The planet has paid the price, and the global south has borne the brunt. Is it just to ask the poorest countries in the world to pay the price of this folly? That's what Greta Thunberg means when she says we can't call for climate justice while advocating for policies that exclude aspects of equity and historic emissions. So her camp is calling for climate justice that takes into account this long arc of history, and the other camp, guided by economic reasoning, wants to focus on how to curb incremental contributions to pollution. So yet again, we find ourselves at an impasse. The thing is that empirical economists have made incredible contributions to the study of inequality. Whether they recognize it or not, the social justice movements that are sweeping the world today rely heavily on economic insights. Thomas Piketty's work has laid the foundation for the global debate on income inequality. The work of Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo has lent texture to the lives of the poor and offered thoughtful solutions to the problems faced by people in countries like Haiti. Claudia Golden's work on the career and family has taught us about how difficult it is to balance the two in the quest for gender equality. Nick Stern's work was instrumental in bringing climate change into the public conscience. There are hundreds more. That these people are all economists is not an accident. Okay? Economics has an indispensable set of tools, empirical tools, that are and must be used to understand and address inequality. And social justice activists would do well to take advantage of the types of empirical insights and nuance and practical solutions that economics has to offer. A fundamental problem, though, is that applied economics lacks a compelling way to think about justice or, Jonathan, for that matter, injustice. This is not to say that we don't think at all about the question of distributive justice. We do. But dominant methods that we use to think about it are guided by utilitarianism and its descendants. And alternative ethical frameworks or questions of morality, which lie at the heart of justice, rarely figure in our empirical analyses. And unless that changes, unless economists find a way to incorporate justice into our otherwise remarkable empirical toolkit, we risk losing our relevance in the eyes of this public. Thank you.